everyone, and welcome to the All About Film for Fomapan Action 400 black and white film. We're going to call it Foma 400 for this video for brevity. We're going to look at how to use it, the film's characteristics, technical details, and also copious sample images. Foma 400 is a fast film rated at 400 ISO, available in 35mm factory-rolled cassettes, 100-foot 35mm bulk spools, 120, 4x5, 5x7, and 8x10. My first tip is that Foma 400 tends to handle a bit of overexposure well. I found that I liked this film the most when I exposed it at 250 ISO and developed it using a 400 ISO developing time. In fact, I think that I ended up exposing this at 250 most of the time and just not recording it that way. Anyway, I did also shoot a lot of rolls at box speed. I'm pretty sure I shot most of the sheet film in the 250 to 400 range, somewhere in that vicinity. My next tip is that Foma 400 has a much different image character in each format, and that's much more so than any other film I've used. In 35mm, I find that Foma 400 is a higher grain than I like, but in sheet film, hey, I like the grain quite a bit. However, in 120, I find Foma 400 to create the smoothest images in terms of low grain and overall tonal quality of any of the film formats. I can't explain it, but I think the photos in this video back that assertion up. So the tip here is that Foma 400 may be your ideal film in a given format, and then you may absolutely hate it in other formats. For filtration, as we'll see in the filter section, yellow filters can add a nice character to this film, and it may be worth keeping a yellow filter on your camera when you shoot Foma 400. My last tip is that, yes, I know that Foma 400 has a mixed reputation. If you've never tried it because people tell you it's not great, well, don't listen to them. Try it in the formats you shoot. You may be pleasantly surprised. I won't ever shoot it in 35mm again, at least not for standard black and white development, but I could definitely see myself enjoying this in 120 cameras again. Grain is format dependent in an odd way. On 35mm, I find it to be too heavy. 4x5 images in some developers kept that overall grain, but the larger format muted it quite a bit. The 120 rolls I took came out with very low grain. I honestly don't know what the difference is, and in theory, 120 should kind of split the difference between 4x5 and 35mm, but it didn't. Tonality and tonal range are only fair, if I'm being nice. Shadows across the developer spectrum that I tested really didn't survive to be recorded on the negatives. Highlights were hard to obtain, and often Foma 400 seemed to record bright areas as rather gray. Acutance was a bit hard to gauge by eye, which I think owes to Foma 400's overall grain structure. Contrast is rather low, which is to say the variations between the tones aren't great, and the darks, though the data in them is lost, can still be kind of muddy with some developers. That said, as a film to record low-key images, this could work well if paired with a good developer for that. Sharpness varies by format, but that could owe to the excessive grain in 35mm, the relative smoothness in 120, and the slightly softer lenses used for large format photography. Foma rates Foma 400, this is in their datasheet, at 90 lines per millimeter, and that's not a whole lot. Dynamic range skews toward the dark tones, and I really had a hard time getting midtones to differentiate, and found that my midtones generally had less of a separation than with other films. Digital conversion is easy with this film because it's black and white, and all of the formats converted well. That said, 35mm digitization of this film really amplified the image grain. One last note, though I did not try this at all, the datasheet does indicate that Foma 400 can be used as a reversal film and provides the resources needed to find out how. The spectral sensitivity curve is used to describe the film's relative sensitivity on the y-axis to visible light colors, which are on the x-axis. This spectral sensitivity curve ought to explain something about how this film records skies. If you noticed, or, well, if you didn't notice before, you will now, this film's skies often had clouds. Not all black and white films can say that, especially without a filter in front of the lens. Foma 400's relatively lower blue tone image recording will help create sky contrast because it records blues darker than other tones, all other exposure parameters being equal. What I mean is that if you have a blue square and a red square next to each other and they're close to the same tone, Foma 400 will record the blue a bit darker than it would record the red. This spectral sensitivity curve indicates a bit about filter performance as well, and we'll see that in a moment in the next section. And namely, it indicates that blue filters will increase shadow detail at the expense of significant sky and distant object detail. In this section, I'll show you sample images of the same scenes, taken with no filter: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, tobacco, pink, purple. The purple is also called CFL. It's not really a black and white filter. Neither are tobacco and pink, but the CFL is used to counter compact fluorescent lighting, or any fluorescent lighting really, with color film. God only knows what pink and tobacco are meant to do. In results that will sound rather like this video section is just boilerplate, but I do promise that it isn't. We're going to see the most interesting results from the warm tone filters, especially yellow. And I think that yellow adds a nice and slight bump in highlight retention and detail. The red filter does a lot to give skies more detail and clarity, and that can be a nice effect for landscapes. If you're a landscape shooter with this, if you can find a gradient filter that is red on top and yellow on the bottom, that could do some very interesting things for your landscape work with this film. Now, in a shock to no one, the green filter once again shows up, gets drunk, launches a farmer's rocket onto the wedding cake, and falls into the gift table. For me, the biggest surprise was the tobacco filter, which does nothing. I'm not used to that because tobacco usually either makes or ruins an image here. It's just, with Foma 400, about as useful as a pencil sharpener in a paintbrush factory. Foma's datasheet refers to reciprocity failure as the Schwarzschild effect. Foma indicates that from 1/1000th of a second to 1/2 second, no exposure compensation is needed. From 1 second to 10 seconds, a compensation of 1.5x is needed, and that corresponds to a full stop increase of your aperture. From 10 seconds to 100, a 6-fold compensation, which is 2.5 stops of aperture increase, is needed. From 100 seconds and longer, an 8-fold increase, which is an increase of 3 aperture stops, is needed to compensate for reciprocity failure. Now, of note, Foma provides those as milestones, and the data should not be read as fixed points, but as a sliding scale. At 5 seconds, it can be assumed that around 3.5 times more light is needed, which would be around 1.7-ish stops of the aperture, and that's just a back of the napkin calculation. So, in practical experience, what does that mean? If you're shooting f/22 for an image and the camera meters it at 1/2 of a second, go crazy, use f/22. Okay, but if you meter at a full second, then shoot it at f/16. If you meter at 10 seconds, you'll need to open up that f/22 to f/9. And if you're shooting at a metered 100 seconds, you'll need to open it up to f/8. The Foma 400 datasheet provides 3 characteristic curves to show how different development times affect negative density. Taking the microfen example as gospel, which is a faulty position, I know, we can assume that Foma 400 has a development latitude of around a minute of underdevelopment and 2 minutes of overdevelopment as a rough guide to still achieve a relatively reasonable image from your negatives. What that means is that Foma 400 will tolerate you accidentally leaving the film in the soup for 30 seconds or a minute too long, and it's going to be just fine. That is part of why Foma 400 is also considered a pretty good beginner film, because you can make some development mistakes and still recover an image. For the development range on this film, the massive development chart provides developing times from 100 to 6400 ISO. Okay. From my personal experience, Foma 400 tolerates overdevelopment a bit, and it tolerates pulling quite well. Don't push it. If you're curious, whatever loon, and I mean that lovingly if you're listening to this, Mr. or Ms. Loon, pushed this stock to 6400 ISO, developed it in Rodinal at 1+25 for 90 minutes. Ain't no one got time for that. I tried 16 developer combinations with Foma 400, and of them I liked Fomadon LQR at 1+10 the best. Now, were I to shoot this film again, I could do so quite happily with Fomadon. My only complaint with LQR is that only one dilution has any published developing times, and that's 1+10. I have a boatload of this stock of film left, and I actually kind of want to test LQR at weaker concentrations like 1+20 and 1+30. I do think that could be a really interesting thing for this film and could really pull something nice out of it. Rounding out my top 3 stocks, XTOL 1+3 and Photographer's Formulary PMK 1+2+100 are both exceptional alternatives to LQR. There's really only one developer I would say not to, for any reason, use with Foma 400 at box speed. Silvermax developer at 1+19. I know, that's usually a house favorite chemistry for me, but it did not look good with this film. Rodinal at 1+50 delivered poor results when I pushed this film to 1600, but Paranol S at 1+50 when shot at box speed I did quite like, so Rodinal may also be a fine option at 1+50 for box speed shooting. Lastly, LegacyPro Mic X 1+3 wasn't worth writing home about. It wasn't bad in that the results could still be interesting, but I'm not used to Mic X delivering results that have grain in the images, and boy, Foma did retain its grain with Mic X. Foma 400 is a fine film, not a house favorite by any means, but I also can understand why people like it. It delivers a look all of its own. Well, it delivers a look that's shared with other film stocks that are actually Foma 400, just sold under different names. And the look that Foma 400 delivers is one of images with a certain mood and tone that, I think not incorrectly, could be viewed as very Eastern Bloc. Deep shadows, sky detail, blown out highlights, and a generally gray overall appearance combine to create a film that can capture captivating cityscapes, portraits, street photos, reportage and documentary work, or, in some select cases, landscapes. I would not use Foma 400 for architecture, astrophotography, action, or wildlife photography. And to that end, no single film by any maker is the perfect film for every use. That's as true of Foma 400 as it is of Delta 400 or TMax 100. So if you are drawn to Foma 400, understand that the look it has will inform the results of your images, and work with the film to deliver the best results that you can.